All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm your temporary special host while Mackenzie Peterson is out on vacation. Thanks for tuning in. We have a great guest today you're going to learn a lot from, and I'm going to make sure I get the pronunciation of your name correct. It's Elemer Piros, right?
That's correct.
Hungarian background you mentioned?
Yep.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. And you're from Lucid Capital Markets. You guys focus not entirely, right? You don't focus entirely in on the psychedelic space, but part of your research offerings for the firm is focused in the psychedelics industry. Is that right?
That is correct.
Terrific.
In my personal portfolio of companies, maybe about 1/3 of the portfolio currently is psychedelic stocks.
Nice, fantastic. Well, listen, let's get right into it. I want to, introduce you to the viewers. So, if you would, tell us a little bit about your background, and what brings you to Lucid and what you guys do there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the invite.
Sure.
So I am a research neuroscientist by training. Did my all my work at the UCLA, both my undergrad and PhD work there, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship here in New York at Cornell Medical School, and focused on neuroscience throughout those years, but left the bench back in 2000 to become a research analyst on Wall Street. And so of course, I started focusing on neuroscience stocks, but it was a love and a hate affair. Ups and downs, and
Right.
more downs at times. And this up and down was also mirrored by the interest from pharma, which for a good, probably about a decade, almost completely abandoned this field, with some few exceptions. So my interest was up and then was off. But about 5 years ago, I started to look at this handful of companies back then that were doing psychedelic medicine research. And just a little bit about Lucid Capital Markets. I started here only about 2 months ago. The firm is relatively new. Started off about a year and a half ago, beginning of last year. And they are probably one of the handful of firms, investment banks out there, that embrace topics such as psychedelic medicine. And it is still not mainstream
Right.
with bulge bracket firms or large institutional investors, because we are dealing with scheduled substances. And we can go into later how that may be eventually resolved once these drugs are going to be approved. So I started this work, as I mentioned, about 5 years ago. We didn't have any structured, proper clinical trial results back then, but we had a lot of anecdotes, and we had 70 years worth of research, mostly in LSD, and literally thousands of papers. Again, anecdotal, small trials, observations, but you just couldn't ignore the results. But these were still, and still are, controlled substances. So I had a great deal of hesitation, because my academic work was sponsored by and funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse.
Mm.
And so anything that is controlled, that was a no
Right.
to me. But then I noticed that another federal agency, the FDA, began to give what they call breakthrough therapy designations for these drugs in clinical trials, going back to 2013. So, a Scheduled 1 substance, by definition, is addictive,
Right.
and it There's no medical value whatsoever.
Yep.
But I was scratching my head, no medical value, yet the FDA tried to foster development of these drugs, and going back more than a decade now. And that's when I decided to do the work, spend the next 6 months or so reviewing the field, which eventually led to a review paper, a 125-page paper to investors to introduce the potential, to introduce what we had at that time, which is very little. But I might add, maybe about 4 years ago during the pandemic, we started to have a lot of media hype.
Right.
About these. So in my review, I try to provide a balanced view of what it can be and what sort of evidence we had at that point of how large the potential or how meaningful these benefits could be for patients.
Right. Yeah, when we launched a product around these stocks, we would describe to people in those earlier days that it's sort of biotech on steroids, right? It was, very speculative, very volatile.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't know if that's changed too much, even though the industry has matured quite a bit. But speaking of that sort of maturing industry, right? What have you seen in terms of changes from 5 years ago when you were first looking at it up to as we're getting closer to today?
Clinical data. Very simple. This is what investors really care about. The hype is okay for the time being or temporarily,
Right.
but there has to be a rigorous analysis of structured, placebo-controlled clinical trial data when you compare these treatments with standard of care. And until that was in, there was no lasting interest in these stocks. And when the first relatively large, over 200 patient trial matured, this is with psilocybin, also called the synthetic version COMP360, there was a bit of a reality that set in. Because while overall the trial showed that the benefit is greater than standard of care, but not everyone was cured. Not everyone went into remission. And, the expectations had to be reset and slowly people started to understand that, while we don't have everyone in remission, the benefit is so significant and so different than a conventional antidepressant that it starts working almost immediately, as opposed to 4 to 6 weeks in when you start an SSRI. The side effects are almost non-existent after the treatment. We still didn't have information of how durable these results are going to be. I think at that time we had up to 3 months worth of data. But those who benefited, they were able to get back to work. They get their lives back. And even if you were in remission, there was a palpable benefit. Right. So this first result, when it came out, I think now it's close to 3 years ago, started to level the playing field or set a good expectation of what it can and what it cannot be. It was shown that it's not a panacea, but it's night and day in terms of the comparison to 30 to 40 to 60-year-old drugs that we currently have.
Right. With the business models that these companies have as they're going through these clinical trials, what are you seeing with some of the challenges of these companies, right? I mean, one of the things we've described is just how expensive that process can be and how capital intensive it can be before they're able to generate any revenue. So what are some of the things that you guys are seeing in these companies as they are growing and maturing and starting to do more of these things?
There is an unfortunate statistic that hasn't changed much over the last 2-3 decades, is that 90% of the drugs will fail once they start clinical trials. And these are usually new chemical entities when the safety has not been established in humans, when the efficacy looks good in rodents, but it's completely unknown in humans. So only 1 out of 10 will make it.
Wow.
What is interesting here that most of these drugs, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, 5-MeO DMT, has been used underground or before they became banned
Right.
in psychiatrists' offices and prescriptions by psychiatrists. So at least we have a good sense that they are relatively safe. So that risk is probably reduced quite significantly. And we also knew that they are not going to be ineffective, meaning the 7 years worth of anecdotes, once we get to a clinical trial that compares it placebo, it will not come up empty, meaning working just as well as placebo. So the business model, the investment that these companies would have to undertake to run through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials is somewhat mitigated by the experience, the history, the publications on this field. But now the challenge is that they have to show similar results to what we've seen with psilocybin in these structured control trials, which they are undertaking. And by the way, we already have at least 5 of these results, including psilocybin, in the controlled setting, in depression, treatment-resistant depression, and anxiety. So these 5 drugs or 5 trials succeeded in multiple indications. So it's no longer we know how effective they can be. Obviously, now they have to show in a phase 3 of the ultimate test in a larger setting before they can get FDA approval and then before they can be commercially launched. Now, this is a different paradigm than a take-home pill. You would have to spend an hour to maybe up to 10 hours, 12 hours in a medical facility while undergoing treatment. And then you can go home. And how often do you have to come back? Maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times a year for this treatment. So the paradigm is definitely different than what we are used to. The infrastructure has to be built out. And we can talk about, if you like later on, of who is helping us, who is helping this industry, and how this infrastructure is actually have been established to a good extent already by the example of intranasal ketamine, which is Spravato treatment.
Right. And maybe that as an example, or other examples you've seen. You mentioned, going through the process of getting the drugs approved. What are the companies learning about that process? Right. That it's hard enough to get to the point of finding the drugs, testing them, trials, things like that. And then it seems like the approval process sometimes is harder than the process of figuring out if these things work or not.
Yep, and especially for drugs that have a consequence, because it's very likely, these are psychoactive drugs, it's very likely that the patient will be able to guess whether they are on treatment or on placebo.
Okay.
The difference is not very subtle, but it's quite dramatic. So that would introduce trial design challenges and educating the FDA. Now, these companies were successful to an extent that the FDA actually came out with guidance on how to do these pivotal trials to their satisfaction. So when they come to them for approval, there wouldn't be a question of why did you do it this way and not that way. And so the map has been laid out. I just have to walk through it. Even a further benefit, because a lot of people have the question of how are they going to be reimbursed. Again, it's not a script that you submit to the insurance company and you get reimbursed. There's the element of someone have to be there during the administration to facilitate and to keep you safe during the event. But we have already specific preliminary reimbursement codes, not only for the drug, but for the facilitator too. And since we are dealing with sometimes an hour to 2 hour experience, sometimes up to 10 to 12, that reimbursement code already factors in that difference between the administration or how much time and effort would have to go in. So these are good basics to have in place even before these drugs actually receive approval.
Right. You had sent a couple of slides to show some examples of things. Is it all right if I bring those up now?
Yeah, I think so, because I would really like to illustrate the difference between what we currently have as a standard of care and what psychedelic drugs can do, again, as tested in formal clinical trials. So the 5 little bars on the left-hand side is the miserable standard of care. I call it miserable because what we have on this chart on the vertical axis is how effective these drugs. I think we need to step back just one slide.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there it is.
And if you look at what the height of these bars represent is a small to medium size effect.
Okay.
Now these come from the official, they call it prescription information that these companies submitted to the FDA. But if you look at the middle, that's the real world experience with these drugs. These trials have been conducted in thousands of patients using a variety of the existing standard of care. The relatively high green bar is the first line when you get your first antidepressant. The second one, once you failed the first one, and the third one, once you failed at least 2. So when we get down to the so-called third line in the real world, the effect size almost is non-existent.
Okay.
Now, if you go to this inset where you have 5 green bars, I compare this real world experience with the standard of care to psilocybin and to 5-MeO-DMT. COMP360 is psilocybin, BPL-003 is 5-MeO-DMT.
Okay.
The difference, you don't have to squint to
Right.
see that we are dealing with a 3 to 4 fold increase in effectiveness in exactly the same treatment resistant setting.
Yeah.
Now, the 5 bars on the right would include psilocybin and 5-MeO-DMT and 3 additional drugs. And if you just, again, very casually look at the height of these bars, they're massive compared to what we would get with an SSRI or an SNRI.
Which are represented by the 3 smaller ones, is that right?
The 3 smaller ones.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And again, we don't have to do a detailed statistical analysis to detect a 10% change, but it's multiple fold improvement in terms of its effectiveness. And so that's why I think there is a growing number of investors, analysts, and the patient community that are very excited about these drugs. Again, not a single one, but 5 different agents. Depression, treatment-resistant depression, and anxiety disorder are represented on these 5 bars on the right-hand side of this chart.
Right. And are they seeing that this is repairing things, or this is treatment for the issues that people have, and they still will continue to maintain that underlying issue, or are they seeing over time this can actually reverse, fix,
Yeah.
solve for the issues?
So with conventional SSRIs, we are treating the
Right.
symptoms. We put people into an emotional band, no highs, no lows, but into a range when they can physically exist on those drugs, if those drugs work for them. With psychedelics, there appears to be a reorganization of the brain. A neuroplasticity is initiated. And whether we look at depression, anxiety, or trauma, there are these circular thought patterns that keep on fueling the condition. It's almost like a vicious cycle. They are disrupted by psychedelics. And so fundamentally, these brain circuits are reorganized, rearranged, and from day one, day two, there is a different view of the world, the environment, the family, which we don't know how long this reorganization will last. We suspect that at least 3 to 4 months or 3 to 6 months, depending on, but we need to do more work
Right.
to understand that. And it's quite possible that we need to have some sort of maintenance treatment of this new state. Because if you think about, for example, addiction, there is a very high rate of relapse,
Right.
even after being sober for weeks or months. And so, if that occurs, retreatment would be helpful
Right.
to maintain a more normalized state.
Yep. That makes sense. And then over time, do you think they would still have to take it as frequently, or over time, can it get you to the place where you have sort of solved it or resolved it, or things have changed in terms of, how your brain's operating and how you treat those things?
It will probably depend on the individual. Not all depression, the mechanism which precipitates the depressed state is the same. So there could be various reasons, and whether it's chemical, genetic, environmental. But these drugs will probably be administered with eventually, once the experiment or the initial treatment is over, with psychotherapy downstream. So it will probably also depend, and the effect has to be integrated to everyday life, and so therapy would help to sustain the benefit for a longer period of time. Now, would it be successful for an individual for 3 months, 6 months, or a year before they have to come back, if ever? We don't know it yet.
That makes sense. We've had an opportunity to have Daniel Carcillo on, the Chicago Blackhawks hockey player, who's well known for all the things that he went through with CTE and concussions and the resulting issues that he had around that. And he talks about his use of psilocybin and how it's completely changed his life. But I remember he was talking as well that he still does go in for periodic treatments, but he just continues to see himself getting healthier and healthier. Let me ask you about, I guess, maybe the downside, or in these trials when they don't work, is the downside or the negative results, let's say sometimes, is it as simple as, well, it just doesn't work? Or have they seen other things that say, oh, it could have a bad effect on certain people, or it's just the bad effect that it didn't take and it didn't help them with their issues they're trying to deal with?
I mean, people report unpleasant experiences with these substances. which could be explained by a number of contributing factors. But I think the biggest disappointment may come for someone who has been treated for a decade with 3 or 4 or 5 different drugs, and they hear about psilocybin or LSD or DMT treatment. They undergo the treatment, and if the treatment doesn't work for them for a variety of reasons, the setting wasn't proper, they weren't ready for the treatment, or they were surprised by the treatment. So if they walk away with disappointment, I think that could have a potential negative effect downstream, because I tried all sorts of things.
Right.
This appeared to be the last resort, and if the results are negative, that could have a very disappointing
Right.
experience.
Yep, that makes
Not
sense.
necessarily precipitated by the drug itself, but the fact that the drug didn't.
Right. The feelings around it, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yep, that makes sense. Actually, I have another slide, right? This other slide is the. Let me pull this up for you.
So I wanted to illustrate the parallels between psychedelic treatment, which is obviously is taking place at a medical facility at various intervals. We don't know precisely how often. And another revolution, and I call this a revolution because we haven't seen this much difference between standard of care and an actual new paradigm that was brought in by psychedelics. And the parallels, in my mind, are to what happened to cancer immunotherapy beginning about a decade ago.
Okay.
What I show here is the effectiveness of 2 of these immunotherapies, and I just randomly chose 5 different cancer indications for both.
And those are along the bottom?
And those are listed on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And the effect size, again, is remarkably consistent, and it's very significantly higher than conventional radiation or chemotherapy. These treatments have to be administered at a medical facility. Some of them has to be administered over months, if not years. And so there were some skepticism about the value there because of the involvement. And even 10 years ago, we already had oral cancer treatment. So there was hesitation on some people's part. And, the more optimistic crowd thought that these drugs could become like what was a remarkable cancer drug, Herceptin, meaning $6 to $7 billion a year.
Okay.
There was one analyst, and I vividly remember because even the Wall Street Journal carried this prediction. He thought that in 10 years, this could be a $35 billion market.
Wow. Okay.
He was off only a little because the 3 drugs that I list on the left totaled $41 billion.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
And so massive benefit, massive difference from standard of care, and the market potential is unpredictably high when you compare it to conventional drugs. Now, the other thing which I think is worth mentioning, that while we have 17 million cancer patients in this country, if you add up depression, anxiety, trauma, substance use disorders, we are dealing with more like 80 million people. We know someone in our surroundings who suffers from these conditions, and we know how poor the standard of care is. And now we started to learn how much better the results from clinical trials with psychedelic medicine.
Nice. Yeah, that's impressive. That's impressive and fantastic, and just great for patients. Though, we're an investing channel, so maybe we'll turn this to some of the companies that you follow. I think I had a list of them on your disclosure slide. So you follow a handful of these companies in the space, right?
The five that I think are in an advanced stage,
Mm-hmm.
all five of them are either in their last phase of clinical development or getting there very soon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and all five, we looked at the data on that bar chart, all five of them have already reported positive outcomes. We have formal rating, well, we covered the entire space, but we have formal buy rating on Atai Life Sciences and Cybin.
Okay.
And the entire space, which we started off with over 20 companies, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, whittled down to this five, and some others who may also survive. But this five is very well capitalized. They have the money to finish off the clinical development and potentially launch their drugs on the
Nice.
marketplace.
Yeah, it's definitely been a challenging time for psychedelic investors for sure. And then we've just started to see that turn, I think, probably since the election, or at least the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, where they felt like, the government agencies would be more open, to some of these drugs and medicines. And so we've really started to see some improvement in that space. Who do you guys work with? Like, where are you guys seeing interest in the conversations around your research? Is it through investors? Is it academics? Is it elsewhere?
So it used to be mostly academics, maybe about 5, 6 years ago. Very little institutional interest that was long-term interest, as opposed to when some of these stocks were flying high 4 or 5 years ago. But that has shifted over the last year quite significantly. We actually see the who is who in the biotech investment world invested in these companies quite significant sums of money.
Right.
They had financings probably totaling over $500 million over the last year. And we see solid ownership by large, sophisticated investor group. And they appear to be here for the long term to see these drugs approved, commercialized, and maybe some of these companies be acquired by large pharma.
That's what I was going to ask you, is what do you think happens next? Do they acquire the drugs? Do they acquire the company? I think it's maybe more the company.
Most of the time, we are dealing with a single late stage asset, so it's going to be likely to be the company,
Right.
Because that would represent the vast majority of the value
Right.
in the company.
Yep, that makes sense. Well, this has been terrific. This has been very helpful information. I love the insight. If people want to read more about your firm, where can they find you? Is it just lucidcapital.com, or is it a different URL?
LucidCM.
LucidCM.com. Right. So
Yeah.
LucidCM.com. And then I might need to, if it's okay with you, I may attach to our live streams, those charts so people can kind of expand them a little bit and look at it.
Yep.
Fantastic. Well, Elemer, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We'd love to have you back on in a few months and check in and see how things have progressed if you're up for it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Noah.
Everybody else, thank you for tuning in. I am going to find this outro video since I'm only the temporary host. But everybody, thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. And Elemer, again, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.